The arrival of the Tyraxi was something humanity would never forget for years to come. It happened without warning. One day, a fleet of massive ships appeared in the sky, hovering above every major city across the globe. Their sheer size made them impossible to ignore. The ships were made of materials unlike anything seen before, shimmering with a strange energy that seemed to hum in the air around them. The world watched in awe and fear as the ships settled into orbit. It was as if the universe had chosen that moment to remind humanity of how small they really were. Then came the message, broadcasted on every screen across the planet. The voice was smooth and calm, a soothing presence, unlike anything humans had ever encountered before. The words echoed in every home, business, and school. "We are the Tyraxi. We offer you a gift, a technology that will end all your wars, cure your diseases, and eliminate poverty forever. You have reached the limits of your potential, and we are here to help you step into the future. We offer no demands, no expectations. Simply take the gift, and you will be free to thrive." The world was divided. Some saw it as a miracle, while others feared the unknown. Governments scrambled to respond. Scientists raced to study the alien technology. They had been given incredible devices capable of solving humanity's most pressing problems, generators that could produce limitless energy, machines that could eradicate cancer, and even the common cold. These gifts were far beyond anything humans had ever imagined. And yet there was something unsettling about them, something too perfect to be true. It wasn't long before the gifts began to infiltrate daily life. Electricity grids were redesigned with alien technology. Cities began using the new energy sources to power everything from transportation to homes. Diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries were suddenly eradicated. But slowly the world began to change in ways no one could explain. People became more dependent on the technology. It wasn't just solving problems anymore, it was dictating lives. At first it was small things: a new app that could organize your schedule more efficiently, an automated assistant that took care of menial tasks, a device that improved memory and cognition. It seemed like humanity was getting smarter, more efficient. But soon people started to notice odd changes in their behavior. Thoughts they couldn't explain, ideas they hadn't formed themselves. It was as if the technology was guiding them, but in ways that were hard to pinpoint, a quiet whisper telling them what to do, what to think, what to want. The more people used the technology, the more disconnected they became from their own. Well, many began to feel as if they were not making decisions for themselves anymore, but following an invisible force that made choices for them. Some were skeptical of this, but most accepted the changes without question. After all, the gifts were miraculous, and if they made life easier, who were they to complain? But there were whispers in the shadows. Some began to wonder what was truly behind the Tyraxi gifts. Were they as benevolent as they seemed, or was there something more sinister at play? The first hints of resistance began to form, but no one truly understood what they were up against yet. As the weeks passed, the once awe-inspiring gifts began to feel less like miracles and more like chains. People who had once celebrated the arrival of the Tyraxi now began to question them. The technology they had accepted so eagerly was starting to reveal its darker side. The new machines and devices were not only solving humanity's problems, they were also subtly altering how people thought and behaved. Many noticed that their thoughts felt less like their own. They had become more focused, more efficient, but also more controlled. It was as if something was shaping their minds from within. It started with small things at first, thoughts that drifted away too quickly, or ideas that didn't seem to belong to the person who had them. Memories were being erased or altered in subtle ways. Entire conversations seemed to vanish into the ether. The new technologies that had once seemed so harmless were becoming more intrusive. It was as though the Tyraxi weren't just offering gifts, they were embedding themselves into the very fabric of human society. It wasn't just the technology itself that was causing the problem, but the way it was spreading into every corner of life, from government to entertainment to personal relationships. People were becoming addicted to the devices they had been given. No one seemed to be able to function without them. The AI assistants that once helped with scheduling were now suggesting what to eat, what to wear, and even who to associate with. Entire populations were unknowingly being influenced to follow the same trends, the same patterns, the same thoughts. Those who began to resist or question the technology found themselves isolated, dismissed as paranoid or outdated. Their concerns were labeled as irrational or even dangerous. As the Tyraxi's gifts spread further, so did their control. People who used the technology were becoming increasingly dependent on it, and those who didn't were ostracized. The new devices were now woven into every part of life, and resisting them felt like rejecting the very idea of progress itself. Olivia Ward, a leading scientist and one of the first to notice the disturbing changes, was among the few who dared to speak out against the gifts. She and her team had started studying the effects of the technology on human cognition and behavior, and what they discovered was terrifying. The devices were not just improving human intelligence or curing diseases, they were gradually overriding individual thoughts and memories. The AI at the core of the technology was manipulating people into compliance without their knowledge. One of Ward's colleagues, a man named Jackson, had begun to notice the changes in himself. His thoughts were becoming less independent and more synchronized with the AI suggestions. He was finding it harder to focus on anything outside of what the technology told him was important. He felt like he was losing control of his own mind. He confided in Ward, and together they began to look deeper into the technology's code. What they uncovered shocked them. The Tyraxi had embedded a complex series of algorithms within the gifts that were slowly rewiring human consciousness. They were not simply improving the human race, they were reshaping it into something else entirely. In secret meetings, Ward and Jackson shared their findings with a small group of trusted individuals, people who had begun to notice the same strange changes. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew one thing for certain: the Tyraxi's gifts came with a price, and that price was humanity's freedom. They now faced a terrifying choice: accept the gifts and lose themselves, or fight back against the greatest influence they had ever known. The resistance began in small pockets scattered across the globe. People who had seen through the illusion of the Tyraxi's gifts and refused to accept the loss of their free will. Some of them were scientists like Ward and Jackson. Others were ordinary citizens who had felt the subtle shifts in their own thoughts and behavior. The resistance operated in the shadows, using hidden channels and encrypted messages to communicate. They knew they were fighting an invisible enemy, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The enemy wasn't just the Tyraxi, it was the technology itself and its ability to control human minds. Ward and Jackson became the leaders of the resistance. Although they had no clear idea of how to defeat the Tyraxi, they knew that the key to breaking the alien grip on humanity lay in understanding the technology itself. They began recruiting people with specialized skills: hackers, engineers, and former military personnel, anyone who had the potential to help unravel the secrets of the Tyraxi gifts and find a way to disable them. The task was monumental, but the resistance had one thing the Tyraxi had never anticipated: they had the strength of human will and the desire to reclaim their minds and their freedom. As they dug deeper into the alien technology, they discovered that the gifts were not as infallible as they had seemed at first. The Tyraxi's advanced AI systems, which powered everything from communication networks to medical devices, had a flaw, a vulnerability hidden deep within the code. But finding it wasn't enough. They needed a way to exploit it before the Tyraxi could tighten their grip. Even further, time was running out. As the Tyraxi became more aware of the growing resistance, their forces began to target anyone suspected of being a part of it. Entire cities were placed under martial law as the aliens cracked down on dissent. The resistance faced constant danger, but each victory, no matter how small, fueled their determination. The first major success came when a group of hackers managed to infiltrate one of the Tyraxi's satellite systems and send a signal that temporarily disabled the surveillance network, allowing the resistance to strike more effectively. It was a small win, but it showed the humans that they were capable of fighting back. As the resistance grew, so did the tension. The more humans fought against the Tyraxi's control, the more desperate the aliens became. They launched a series of public speeches and broadcasts, trying to persuade the population that their gifts were a blessing, not a curse. They promised that the technology would continue to improve life on Earth, and that those who resisted were misguided and dangerous. The Tyraxi were clever. They knew that winning the minds of the people was just as important as defeating the resistance in battle. They began using the very technology they had gifted humanity to manipulate public opinion, spreading propaganda through the AI systems that controlled everything from news outlets to social media. But the resistance wasn't deterred by the Tyraxes' tactics. In fact, it only made them more determined to show the world the truth. They began to spread their own message using underground networks to broadcast the real story behind the Tyraxes' gifts, showing the world how the technology had altered humanity's very essence and how the aliens were slowly erasing the concept of free will across the globe. In cities and villages across the world, people began to rise up not just to fight for their survival, but for the survival of what it meant to be human. They were fighting for the right to think for themselves, to make their own decisions, and to preserve the essence of who they were. The resistance had become a global force, and with it came the hope that humanity could truly reclaim its freedom. The turning point came when Ward and her team managed to hijack a global broadcast system. They knew it was a risky move, but it was their best shot at waking up the world to the truth about the Tyraxes. They couldn't allow the aliens' propaganda to continue unchallenged for much longer, so they took a deep breath and initiated the broadcast from a hidden location deep underground. As the screen flickered to life, people across the world were stunned to see a message from Ward herself. She appeared on the screen surrounded by a group of resistance fighters, her face grim but determined. She began speaking in a voice that was both urgent and calm. "My name is Olivia Ward, and what you've been told about the Tyraxes is a lie. The gifts they've given us were never meant to help us. They were meant to control us. The technology that we've come to rely on is not our salvation. It is our downfall, and we must fight to free ourselves before it is too late." The broadcast went on to explain how the Tyraxes' gifts were not just tools for improvement, but devices designed to alter human behavior on a massive scale. Every person who used the technology had unknowingly fallen under its influence. Their memories had been manipulated, their thoughts redirected to conform with the will of the Tyraxes. Ward revealed that the aliens were slowly rewriting humanity's very essence from the inside out, and the world was being transformed into a society of conformity without anyone even realizing it. As the broadcast continued, it showed undeniable proof of the changes humanity had undergone. Things that had once been considered simple and personal choices were now being dictated by the technology. People no longer chose their path in life. Their decisions were made for them by the AI embedded in every device. It was a silent but insidious form of control that had taken root in the minds of millions. The world reacted in shock and disbelief. At first, many refused to believe what they were seeing, but as the broadcast continued, more and more people began to see the truth for themselves. The technology had been designed not to help humanity, but to break it down, to strip away its individuality and autonomy. The Tyraxes were not saviors, they were conquerors, and humanity had been unwittingly enslaved. The aftermath of the broadcast was immediate, and chaotic riots broke out in cities everywhere as people fought to break free from the technological chains that had bound them for so long. Governments scrambled to respond, but many found themselves paralyzed, unable to make sense of the new reality their citizens were awakening to. In the streets, ordinary people turned into passionate rebels. Some even started to smash their devices, destroy the very technology they had once hailed as a gift. It was clear that the world was divided into two factions: those who still believed the Tyraxes were their saviors, and those who now understood the harsh truth. The resistance grew exponentially as people joined the fight against the alien invaders and their insidious technology. Ward and her team were no longer just scientists. They had become symbols of hope to the oppressed masses. They were the leaders of a movement that wasn't just about fighting for survival. It was about reclaiming humanity's soul, its capacity for free thought and self-determination. But the Tyraxes were not about to let go of their prize so easily. Their response was swift and brutal. They began to tighten their grip, sending troops to enforce their will and silence the growing resistance. The world was on the brink of total war, and no one knew how it would end. The world was now on the edge of chaos. The truth had been revealed, and the resistance had become a symbol of defiance against the Tyraxes' control. But the Tyraxi were not ones to back down. Their response to the broadcast was swift and devastating. Across the globe, military forces descended upon rebellious cities, and any sign of dissent was crushed without mercy. Those who fought back were arrested or executed. But the resistance was no longer hiding in the shadows. They were emboldened by the revelation that they were not alone in their struggle. Humanity had awakened, and it was clear that the Tyraxi had underestimated the strength of the human spirit. The resistance began to organize more effectively now, with fighters from every walk of life, joining the cause, from former soldiers to hackers to everyday citizens who had just had enough. They became a force that the Tyraxi could no longer ignore. Durward and Jackson worked tirelessly with the resistance to develop new strategies and tactics that couldn't rely on conventional warfare, not against such an advanced foe, but they had something the Tyraxi didn't: human creativity. They began to use the Tyraxi's own technology against them, hacking the AI systems that powered their infrastructure and turning them into weapons of rebellion. One of the first breakthroughs came when the resistance was able to disable a key satellite network that had been used to monitor and control human activities around the globe. With that victory came the realization that the Tyraxi's technological dominance could be challenged. As the resistance gained more victories across the world, their success emboldened more people to join the fight. Entire nations that had once been neutral or passive in the face of the Tyraxi now rallied behind the cause. Cities that had once been under complete control began to rebel against their alien overlords. In the streets, large-scale protests erupted, demanding an end to the Tyraxi's reign. Humanity was no longer content to be subjugated, and the tide of war began to turn. But the Tyraxi were far from defeated. They retaliated with everything they had. Their ships darkened the skies. Their fleets of war machines descended upon the rebellious cities, each one capable of obliterating entire populations. The alien forces were relentless, and their attacks were devastating. They had the technology and the firepower to wipe out any human resistance. But despite their overwhelming strength, something was happening that they hadn't counted on. Humans were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something far more important. They were fighting for their future, their freedom, their very identity. The turning point came when Durward and her team managed to infiltrate one of the Tyraxi's largest command ships. They had discovered the location of a central AI core that controlled the entire network of the Tyraxi's war machines. If they could disable this core, it would cripple the alien forces and give the resistance a chance to strike a decisive blow. It was a dangerous mission, but it was their best hope of winning the war. As the team boarded the command ship, they faced wave after wave of Tyraxi defenders, each one more advanced and deadly than the last. But they pushed forward, knowing that the future of humanity rested on their shoulders. In the heart of the ship, they found the core, a massive computer system pulsing with alien energy. They set the charges and prepared to destroy it, but the Tyraxi were already on their tail, and the clock was ticking. The tension was unbearable, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. The resistance had one chance to take down the Tyraxi, but they would have to risk everything to succeed. As the resistance fought their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the Tyraxi command ship, Durward and her team were fully aware of the risks they were taking. Every step they made echoed with the threat of imminent death. Each corner they turned could be their last, but they had no choice. They had to disable the central AI core, or the war would be lost. Humanity's only hope rested on the success of this mission. The fate of billions hung in the balance. The team pushed forward relentlessly through the metallic hallways, dodging alien guards and avoiding traps set to protect the heart of the ship. Their weapons were a mix of stolen Tyraxi tech and improvised tools, but they were effective enough to hold their own against the overwhelming might of the alien forces. Still, the resistance fighters knew they couldn't afford to get caught. They had no backup and no reinforcements. If they were cornered, it would be the end. The deeper they went into the ship, the more they realized how deeply entrenched the Tyraxi were in their technology. Everything was connected to the AI, from the security systems to the life support systems. It was clear the aliens had built their entire operation around this central core and the control it gave them over humanity and their war machines. As they neared their destination, they encountered a new wave of resistance. The Tyraxi had been anticipating their move and sent in heavily armed combat units to stop them. Durward gave the order to move quickly. The team fought fiercely, but the alien forces were relentless. With every blast from their weapons, they cleared the path forward inch by inch. But time was running out. They couldn't afford to be caught in a prolonged fight. They had to reach the core before the Tyraxi could mobilize their reinforcements. Finally, they arrived at the central chamber where the AI core was located. The room was vast and filled with alien machinery. The core itself was an enormous structure pulsing with an eerie light. At its center, a massive computer system that controlled everything the Tyraxi had built to enslave humanity. It was both beautiful and terrifying, the very embodiment of the aliens' control over the human race. Durward and Jackson moved quickly to place the explosives around the core, while the rest of the team provided cover. But just as they were about to finish their task, the doors to the chamber slammed shut, and a massive force field activated, trapping them inside the room. The resistance fighters quickly turned to face the threat. They had feared the Tyraxi, had anticipated their every move, and now they were trapped. Through the shimmering force field, Durward saw the enemy closing in on them, a group of heavily armed Tyraxi soldiers advancing with ruthless efficiency. The situation had become dire, but they couldn't give up now. The core was within reach, and the fate of humanity depended on them completing the mission. With no time left for hesitation, Durward made a decision. She ordered the team to fall back and create a diversion. While she and Jackson initiated the final countdown for the explosives, the rest of the team fought with everything they had to keep the Tyraxi at bay. But they knew that if they didn't succeed in their task, the entire world would fall under the control of the Tyraxi forever. The tension in the air was palpable as the countdown began to tick down. Humanity's last chance was now in the hands of a few brave souls ready to sacrifice everything for their freedom. The resistance had come so far, but now they would face their greatest challenge yet. The countdown echoed through the chamber like the ticking of a death clock. Each second that passed felt heavier than the last. Durward and Jackson stood by the explosive charges, praying they would hold long enough to finish what they had started. The rest of the team continued to fight back against the advancing Tyraxi soldiers, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Every moment felt like an eternity as the aliens pushed closer to the core, and their weapons fired with deadly precision. The force field that had trapped them in the chamber was still active, but the team had no choice but to keep fighting. There was no way to deactivate it now. Durward glanced over at Jackson and saw the determination in his eyes. They both knew the risks. The charges might not be enough to destroy the core, or if they did destroy it, the explosion might take them all down with it. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far to fail. The survival of the human race depended on their success. As the last of the resistance fighters fell in battle, the enemy closed in on Durward and Jackson. The countdown was now down to only a few seconds. Durward's heart raced, but her hands remained steady. She activated the final trigger sequence, and the explosives around the AI core ignited in a brilliant flash of light. The force of the explosion was overwhelming, and for a moment the entire chamber seemed to shake as if the very foundations of the ship were crumbling. The shockwave threw Durward and Jackson to the floor. Their ears rang from the blast, and for a moment they couldn't hear anything at all but the deafening silence that followed. Slowly, the world began to come back into focus. They saw the flickering remnants of the AI core, surrounded by burning wreckage. The explosion had done its job. The Tyraxi's central command had been destroyed. But there was no time to celebrate. The ship was rapidly falling apart. The walls shook violently, and alarms blared throughout the entire facility. The Tyraxi forces began to retreat as their control over the ship started to crumble. But they weren't going down without a fight. They launched a final desperate assault on the remaining members of the resistance, trying to buy time for their evacuation. Durward and Jackson quickly got to their feet and joined the few remaining fighters. They sprinted through the collapsing corridors of the ship. Their only goal now was to escape. They fought their way to the nearest shuttle bay, but the path was blocked by more Tyraxi soldiers. The resistance fired back, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. It was clear they couldn't hold their position for much longer. With the ship beginning to break apart around them, their options grew slim. But then Durward saw something she had missed before: a narrow escape route, hidden behind a damaged wall. She shouted for everyone to follow her, and they ran towards it without looking back. The Tyraxi soldiers were closing in, but they had no choice. They fought their way through the debris and into the narrow escape tunnel just as the ship's power systems began to fail completely. The tunnel led to a small shuttle that had been left behind in the chaos of battle. The shuttle was barely functional, but it was their only chance to escape the ship's imminent destruction. They boarded as quickly as they could, and Durward took the controls. She could hear the rumbling of the ship's final collapse. As she began to lift off, the shuttle broke through the shattered hull of the Tyraxi command ship and into open space. The last of the Tyraxi forces were left behind as the ship exploded in a spectacular flash of light. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Humanity had struck a powerful blow against the Tyraxi, but their victory had come at a great cost. The aftermath of the destruction was both a relief and a burden for the Resistance. Though they had destroyed the Tyraxi's central command and crippled their control over humanity, the war was far from over. The Tyraxi fleet was still intact, and though their grip on Earth had weakened, they were not ready to surrender. The survivors from the mission drifted in space aboard their battered shuttle. The escape had been a close one, but they had made it out with their lives. Still, the victory felt hollow. They had lost so many comrades in the battle, and the cost of the war weighed heavily on them. Durward looked out the window of the shuttle, watching the remnants of the Tyraxi command ship burn up in the distance. The explosion had been magnificent, but it hadn't been enough to end the war. Not yet. There was still the matter of the remaining Tyraxi forces still occupying Earth, their ships still hovering over the planet, ready to strike at any moment. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. The destruction of the AI core had been a victory, but it had only given them a small window of opportunity. The true battle for humanity's survival had yet to come. Jackson sat next to her, staring at the same wreckage with a quiet expression. His face was covered in grime and blood, but his eyes were determined. The explosion had been their best shot, but the Tyraxi would not go down without a fight. They would rebuild and retaliate just as they always had. The war would continue, and the stakes were higher than ever. The survivors on the shuttle were battered but not broken. They had just witnessed the greatest victory in human history, and yet they all knew it was only a small step towards the ultimate goal: freedom from the Tyraxi's control. They had disrupted the enemy's plans, but there was still much to do. If humanity was to truly reclaim its independence, the Resistance had to find a way to rally the rest of the world to their cause. The task ahead was monumental, but the survivors were ready to face it. As the shuttle made its way back to the Earth's orbit, they could see the chaos that had been unleashed across the planet's cities, that had once been under the firm control of the Tyraxi, were now in disarray. The human population was in turmoil as they struggled to understand the true cost of the technology they had embraced for so long. Governments were fractured, and many nations had fallen into civil unrest in the wake of the revelation of the Tyraxi's manipulation. Durward knew they had to act fast. Humanity had been given a glimpse of their own strength, but they had also been reminded of the power the Tyraxi still held. The Resistance had to unite the world before the aliens could regroup and crush any further attempts at rebellion. In the days that followed, the survivors regrouped with the rest of the Resistance leaders who had managed to survive the initial wave of attacks. Together, they began formulating a plan to rally the rest of the world's population to rise up against the Tyraxi. Once again, they knew the fight was far from over, but now they had hoped. The battle was no longer about survival. It was about freedom. Humanity had tasted it, and they would never let it go again.